and killing and a form of terrorism, violence, and injustice out of California. And the evil of taking life, Sister Palmer, is just vile and vicious by ISIS or anyone else. And we have to pray for those families who lost those lives brutally. But as we look at the response of many, I hear a call from Dr. King, and since this church, Dr. Warnett told me represents an African hut, I hear a call from the ancestors to use our influence to speak the truth in the midst of terror, violence, and injustice, that disease, TBI, and to challenge a fundamental misdiagnosis, because many are and will try to pimp and prostitute the deaths in California for their own vicious political agenda. Some, like those sly as a fox newscasters, who abuse the platform they have through Fox Television, have been using the death of these innocent people to push their racist and fear-mongering agenda against the president, against immigrants, and against Muslims. One of these flaky Fox fellas said that the greatest threat to national security ever is a president who is incapable psychologically and politically, and who is not in the business of protecting Americans. Protecting Muslims, he said. Now, to be honest, in the tradition of Dr. King, you can't agree with everything President Obama's done. President Obama was asked that when he was running for office. He said, what do you think Dr. King would be with your candidacy? He said he would be challenging me. Why y'all get quiet? I'm talking about Dr. King now and Micah. Right. But that kind of critique is ridiculous. He's not psychologically and politically able to protect Americans but Muslims. Muslims are Americans. Muslims are soldiers in our military. You cannot castigate a whole religion like people used to castigate black people and think we're going to sit around and let it go unchallenged. Well, since somebody brought Dr. Cornel West in the room a minute ago, what's going on here is what Cornel West might call the niggerization of certain people. That's a formal term. It is the wholesale attempt to impede democratization, to turn potential citizens into intimidated, fearful, and helpless subjects. What they are doing, what some are doing, reveals what Phyllis Bennis and I were talking about the other night. As I discussed this with her, we don't have in America a Muslim problem. We don't even have, first and foremost, a terrorism problem, as much as we have a race problem and a xenophobia problem. Let's get the diagnosis right. Let me push it a little bit further. Terrorism is real because millions of people live in terror. But we must be clear about the root of this terror. We cannot, in the legacy of Dr. King, misdiagnose the malignancy of terrorism. It's not Islam, and it's certainly not all foreign. Terror also has American export. And we cannot hide behind blind, infallible notions of American exceptionalism and deny this. Even one of our national hymns in the second verse says, America, America, God, mend thy every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Our misdiagnosis of terrorism and violence occurs when it is rooted in a heretical notion that some people just don't matter as much as others. So in your debate, you talk about terrorism when it happens in Paris, but you don't say anything when it happens in Nigeria.
It's true.
The greatest terrorist attacks in history have American handprint all over them. That is not a statement of hate. Dr. King said it. 67, it's a statement of love. The Middle Passage, the slavery of millions of black human beings, followed by 100 years of legalized Jim Crow, terrorism. Lynchings, terrorism. The series of terrorist race riots that killed thousands of black people from Springfield to Tulsa to Wilmington in the late 18 and 1900s. Church bombings, the assassination of Martin, Malcolm, Medgar, Viola Woosa, a white woman, James Reed, Harriet and Harriet Moore, etc., etc., etc. Let us not forget the Trail of Tears of the indigenous people that were here before all of us. Let us not forget how our nation supported apartheid and its terror and only divested after massive civil disobedience and protests. Was an embarrassment on the world stage. You remember in 2013, that article in the New Republic that talked about some of the people who are saying they hate terrorism today are part of the legacy that stood up against Nelson Mandela. Ronald Reagan embraced the South African apartheid regime. So-called moral majority leader Jerry Falwell called Bishop Tutu a phony who didn't speak for the South African black. North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms filibustered the sanction bill. Strom Thurmond and Phil Graham opposed it. And many of the Tea Party leaders today were the same folk then that were supporting the apartheid regime.
Wow.
If we don't have a conversation about terrorism, let's have a real conversation. Let us also be clear that many of the people who now we denounce as terrorists, we once had relationships with. Now, that does not make their actions wrong, but it also doesn't mean our hands are clean.
Exactly.
If you had a relationship with Osama, if you had a relationship with Saddam, because you wanted oil, let us be clear. Yes, San Bernardino was terrorism, but so was Mother Emanuel. So was Mother Emanuel. So was Mother Emanuel. And why wasn't it called that? Why didn't we ask the question, why did the killer of the people in Charleston do it on the same day that Nat Turner and his followers had been arrested 100 years earlier, and why did he end up in Shelby, North Carolina, which is the home of the author of the book Birth of a Nation? Yeah. Drone attacks on civilians in Afghanistan is terrorism. Carpet bombings of cities is terrorism. We must not forget that the key leaders of ISIS met and developed their agenda in U.S.-run prison at Camp Baka in Iraq that wouldn't have been there if we had never gone into that war. Let us be clear. When some in our country are loud when Palestinian groups target children and civilians, they should, but they say nothing when Israel does the same and refuses statehood to Palestinians. We cannot claim moral high ground. And let us not forget domestic terrorism. You remember those names? Timothy McVeigh? Or right out west now, where persons have threatened to kill FBI agents. Let's take a moment and say, I wonder what the standoff would look like if they were black or Latino. What about the shooting of Muslim students in a parking lot in Chapel Hill, and the killer not called a terrorist? What about rogue racist police shooting unarmed black people in Chicago, Charlotte, New York? Timmy Rice, no indictment. Jonathan Ferrell, a hung jury, and the Attorney General refusing to go back, trying to say to us that a hung jury is a spoken jury. And you won't find a lawyer in here that agree with that. But let's go further. Terrorism, 30,000 people in the United States killed every year by guns. Americans under 25 will be killed more by guns than cars.